Welcome to Audit the Audit, where we sort out the who and what and the right and wrong of police interactions. This episode covers reasonable suspicion, obstruction of legal process, and lawful orders, and is brought to us by the Rowdy Podcast channel. Be sure to check out the description below and give them the credit that they deserve. Before we dive into the interaction, I want to give a big thanks to the sponsor of this episode, News Voice. In a society that is becoming increasingly more digitized, more and more news organizations are being bought out by large corporations competing to dominate the news industry. This is a process known as media consolidation and has the potential to affect what information the public is made aware of and the contextual narratives surrounding that information. News Voice is a revolutionary new app that offers its users access to all the information you need to draw your own conclusions about the news. The News Voice app works by aggregating stories from all over the world and compiling them into one easy-to-use platform. Every story shows multiple sources, each tagged with their political bias and perspective. News Voice allows you to create a custom news feed so that you can see the stories that matter to you the most, and even allows you to take part by adding sources and stories you find relevant. The News Voice app is available on both iOS and Android and is completely free. You can support ATA by downloading News Voice using the link in the description and experience a new take on the news. Thanks again to News Voice for sponsoring this episode. Sometime around May 17th, 2020, podcaster and First Amendment auditor John Mitchell was filming the outside of the St. Louis Park Police Department in St. Louis Park, Minnesota, when he was contacted by Officer Todd Hines of the SLPPD.
Hello.
What's going on?
Not much, just walking around.
Videotaping the police department's not a good idea.
Why? You guys are friendly people.
We are, but why are we doing this?
Why wouldn't we?
Because it's a security issue for us.
Is it?
It is.
I don't think so.
It is.
It's public property.
It is public property, but when you start recording our perimeter and our gates and what our activities are, it's a concern to us.
I've only been here for about 15 minutes.
Right. We had officers that drove by and saw you pulling out of here, walking out of here, and said that you were recording them as they left.
I did.
Yeah, and that's an issue. Why are we doing that?
I don't have to have a reason.
You don't have a reason.
I don't have to have one.
Okay. Do you have a driver's license? I can see.
I don't.
What is your name?
I'm not going to give that to you.
You're not going to give it to me.
No. Why would I give it to you? I haven't done anything wrong.
Well, you're recording our property, you're recording our building,
Sure.
and it's a security issue for us.
Am I being detained?
You are,
Okay.
until I can get you identified.
And what's your reasonable,
Because I want to make sure that you're
articulable
not
suspicion?
doing something that's a problem for our law enforcement community.
So in order to detain somebody, you have to have a law that you're investigating, correct? So which law are you, what law do you suspect me of breaking?
Contrary to popular belief, law enforcement officers do not need to suspect that a specific crime is, has, or about to take place in order to acquire reasonable suspicion. In the infamous Supreme Court case of Terry versus Ohio, the court noted that reasonable suspicion requires, quote, specific and articulable facts which, taken together with rational inferences from those facts, reasonably warrant an intrusion. The Supreme Court went on to establish a two-step analysis for stop and frisk situations. First, if the officer has reasonable articulable suspicion to believe that crime is afoot based on their observations and rational inferences drawn from them, their training, and their experience, the officer may stop the suspect. Second, if the crime the officer believes is occurring is a violent one, or if the officer otherwise has reasonable suspicion to believe the suspect is armed and dangerous, the officer may perform a frisk. As mentioned many times on this channel, reasonable suspicion requires a compounding of facts that suggest that some criminal activity is present in order to justify a stop by a police officer. And legal activities can amount to reasonable suspicion when accompanied by other suspicious factors. In the 1968 Supreme Court case of Cibron versus New York, the court held that, quote, the inference that persons who talk to narcotics addicts are engaged in the criminal traffic in narcotics is simply not the sort of reasonable inference required to support an intrusion by the police upon an individual's personal security. And this conclusion easily translates to this interaction. Mr. Mitchell is exercising a constitutionally protected right within a traditional public forum, and the inference that persons who film a public building from a public sidewalk in broad daylight are engaged in breaching the security of that building is simply not the sort of reasonable inference required to support an intrusion by the police upon an individual's personal security. Although Officer Hines has a suspicion, that does not mean that his suspicion has rose to the level required to effectuate a detainment of Mr. Mitchell.
Are you looking to create a problem here for us? Or
No,
what are you
not at
trying
all.
to
I'm
do?
being polite and cordial.
I'm being polite and cordial too, so I'm
you're
asking for
being a
your
little
name and date of
difficult.
birth so we can identify you.
I don't need to.
And be on our way.
Why would I need to identify myself?
Because I'm asking you to identify yourself.
What's your name and badge number?
My name is Todd Hines. My badge number is 200.
Okay. Your name and badge
We're
number?
recording you just like you're recording
Good.
us.
Okay, good.
So
Okay. Well, I mean, I'd like to be on my way to go. I mean, you have to have
are you
reasonable...
refusing to identify yourself?
Well, there's no need to.
3916. Can we get
Are you a
17?
supervisor? Okay. You just called for a supervisor?
I did.
Very good. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah, you bet.
I don't have any ill will. I'm not here to hurt anybody.
So
I'm
what's
not
the problem
armed.
with identifying yourself?
I don't need to.
You don't need to.
No, it's my right to not.
Oh, so you're looking to create problems is what you're doing.
No, you're just accusing me of that.
Absolutely, because you're refusing to identify yourself.
That's not against the law.
It's obstructing legal process if we have a reason to ask you.
Minnesota is one of 26 states which do not have stop and identify statutes written into their laws. Subsection 1 of Minnesota Statute 609.50 states that whoever intentionally obstructs, hinders, or prevents the lawful execution of any legal process, civil or criminal, or apprehension of another on a charge or conviction of a criminal offense is guilty of obstructing legal process. The key phrase of this statute in reference to this interaction is the lawful execution. As stated earlier in this episode, Officer Hines did not retain the legal authority to compel Mr. Mitchell to present his identification, which renders the command to produce ID unlawful, and essentially negates the validity of a charge against Mr. Mitchell under Code 609.50. Officer Hines is attempting to use the authority of Code 609.50 to circumvent the state's lack of a failure to identify statute, and goes on to suggest that he is basing his reasonable suspicion on his opinion that Mr. Mitchell is, quote, looking to create problems.
What's your reason? I've asked you that.
Identify you. I just told you.
No, but I asked you.
You're recording our property.
I have
you're
to identify
recording what we're
myself.
doing,
Correct. And I have
and
to
asked you
identify myself
yourself.
if you have
And you're
a
refusing.
reasonable,
I do.
articulable suspicion. And what is that?
You're looking to create problems, is what you're doing.
Is that what I'm doing? By just
that's
filming
my
and
opinion.
exercising my First Amendment rights?
That is my opinion, yes.
Okay. Well, the good thing is the law doesn't go off your opinion.
But it does when you're obstructing our requests.
You can't. You can request, right? But it's not a lawful order.
It is a lawful order at this point.
If
And as soon as my sergeant gets up
Sure.
here, he's going to tell you the same thing.
okay.
Okay?
44 states, the District of Columbia, and the federal government make it a crime to disobey the lawful orders of police officers. But there is significant uncertainty about what makes an order lawful. The language of each state's lawful order statutes varies, and many higher courts, including the Supreme Court, have failed to address the distinction between lawful and unlawful commands. In the 1973 New York trial court case of People v. Jennings, the court adopted the ambiguous notion that a lawful order is one that is designed to reasonably achieve its lawful objective, but failed to elaborate further. And New York's highest court has yet to set a precedent. The Oregon Court of Appeals declared that judges must evaluate the legality of an officer's instruction on a case-by-case basis with, quote, few, if any, bright-line rules, noting that an almost infinite variety of variables could come into play. The court's reluctance to clarify the issue is not the only factor at play when discussing lawful commands. For instance, it is often difficult to distinguish orders which civilians must obey from requests which they need not obey. The lack of clear law leaves citizens in the dark about their rights and obligations during police encounters, and tips the balance of power in the officer's favor, encouraging them to escalate altercations. This notion was demonstrated in the 2015 arrest of Sandra Bland, who refused to extinguish her cigarette after being ordered to do so by the officer conducting the traffic stop. Mrs. Bland also refused to comply with the officer's order to exit her vehicle and was subsequently arrested. Although there is clear precedent in regards to whether an officer may order a suspect out of their vehicle, as per the 1977 Supreme Court case of Pennsylvania versus Mims, the ambiguity surrounding the officer's order to extinguish a cigarette created a cloud of confusion and distrust between Mrs. Bland and the officer, which likely led to her questioning the legitimacy of his orders that were in fact lawful. The distinction between lawful and unlawful commands is a thinly veiled line that often leads to arrest when challenged, and even higher courts struggle with the nuance and implications of officer commands. Luckily for Mr. Mitchell, Officer Hines decided to consult his superior before moving forward with the interaction, who arrived on the scene moments later.
This gentleman's got a First Amendment right, he says, to videotape our activities around the police department, and is refusing to identify himself so that we know who we're dealing with.
Okay, you don't want to identify yourself? Who you
Well,
are?
I don't need to. He said he doesn't suspect me of a crime or anything, and I'm
Okay,
just...
I'm just asking.
No, but no, sir, I
I'm
don't.
just asking. Okay, we're good. Let's go.
Okay.
Have a nice day.
My name's John, by the way. Thanks. Take care, guys.
Cooperation, America.
What's that?
Thanks for your cooperation.
Sergeant, what was your name and badge number?
Sergeant Natum, badge number 239.
Thank you, sir. You have a good day.
The St. Louis Park officers left the scene, and Mr. Mitchell returned to his vehicle without further incident. Following the encounter, Mr. Mitchell told me that he decided not to file a complaint against Officer Hines, but did call the department approximately 1 week after the incident and was assured that the sergeant would be addressing the issue with his officers. Overall, Officer Hines gets a C- for detaining Mr. Mitchell for exercising a constitutionally protected activity, accusing Mr. Mitchell of nefarious conduct with no legitimate evidence, and maintaining a hostile and condescending demeanor throughout the interaction. Officer Hines' LinkedIn profile shows that he has been with the St. Louis Park Police Department for over 29 years, and it is clear that he is still adjusting to the modern standards of policing that are forcing the industry to evolve and adapt to the expectations of its constituents. It should be recognized that Officer Hines decided to contact a sergeant without Mr. Mitchell requesting one, but that does not excuse Officer Hines' decision to detain Mr. Mitchell or his unprofessional candor. This interaction highlights the reverberations of outdated policing that still resonates amongst the ranks of officers who are nearing the end of their law enforcement tenure, and Officer Hines would do well to adapt the modern standards into his arsenal of policing tactics. Mr. Mitchell gets an A for maintaining a calm and collected demeanor throughout the interaction, challenging the legitimacy of Officer Hines' assertions, and exercising his constitutionally protected rights in a legitimate and professional way. Mr. Mitchell deserves recognition for crafting an auditing style that maintains a careful balance between reserving his rights and emphasizing a respectable presence. It is rare to find auditors who are capable of exercising their rights without becoming emotionally charged and vulgar when challenged by members of law enforcement. Although Mr. Mitchell chose not to file a formal complaint against Officer Hines, I commend him for following up with the department to ensure that the officers were educated on the proper protocol when interacting with members of the public. I encourage you all to give your support to Mr. Mitchell's channel and check out the Rowdy podcast. You can find those links in the description below. Sergeant Natum gets an A+ for assessing the situation with a measure of objectivity, accurately concluding that Mr. Mitchell's conduct was legal, and allowing Mr. Mitchell to go free without further incident. I commend the sergeant for quickly bringing an end to the unnecessary encounter and respecting Mr. Mitchell's rights. Sergeant Natum's conduct demonstrates exactly how a First Amendment audit should begin and end, and his willingness to contradict the prerogatives of his fellow officers is honorable. Let us know if there is an interaction or legal topic you would like us to discuss in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and be sure to like and subscribe for more police interaction content.